Marbury Education, A2 US Government and Politics, the Separation of Powers. This podcast will help you to understand some of the historical realities of the separation of powers, and we'll discuss the rule of law, Train versus New York City 1975, INS versus Chadha 1983, and the independent executive agencies as they relate to the separation of powers doctrine of the US Constitution. The rule of law. It was Harry Truman who seized the steel mills during the Korean War because there were industrial disputes going on over pay, and this had the real possibility of interrupting war production. A complaint by the mill owners led to the Supreme Court ruling in 1952, Youngstown Sheep and Metal Co. versus Sawyer, that such presidential action was illegal under the separation of powers. Congress had already passed a law which regulated this sort of scenario where national interest was affected by industrial disputes, and the President, by ignoring that law, was breaching the Constitution to set out that the Congress, as the law-making authority, and other branches were to abide by the law. In fact, the President is constitutionally obligated to ensure that he faithfully executes the laws of the United States. So the justices simply invoked the doctrine of supremacy of the law. In this case, the court ruled the executive should be mindful about Congress's right not only to make the law, but to have that law respected by other branches of government. Okay, we can move on now to our second case, which is Train versus New York City, 1975. Here then, the President as Chief Executive has no power to countermand congressional authorization of funds, in this case for the controlling and abating of water pollution. The President must expend full amounts authorized by Congress. However, even Thomas Jefferson impounded funds when funds were no longer necessary to achieve the objective. The President doesn't have limitless impoundment power, and when Richard Nixon sought to kill off environmental projects that he had originally vetoed, having been frustrated by Congress by a 2/3 majority had overridden that veto, the President could not legally frustrate the will of Congress through impoundment. As such, the Congress makes the law and authorizes and appropriates funds, and the President should be mindful about the constitutional power of Congress to do so. What Richard Nixon was attempting to do was circumvent Congress's constitutional power to override his veto by refusing to spend the funds necessary to prevent water pollution. Again, the court sided with the legislative branch when the constitutional powers of the President appeared to be abused for ideological purposes. By ideological, I mean Nixon's ideological objection to environmental regulation. Now we can move on to our third case, Immigration and Naturalization Service versus Chadha, 1983. Here then, a student of Kenyan descent and Indian parentage who was studying in the United States was to be deported after his visa ran out. He appealed, and the INS, who suspended the deportation because neither Kenya nor India recognised him as a national. However, Congress challenged the suspension, and with a full resolution of the House, and sought to deem the Attorney General's ruling and suspension of the deportation null and void. The Supreme Court ruled that this broke the separation of powers and that Congress must pass a law according to the constitutionally prescribed process for it to become binding. something set out in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. Congress had broken the bicameral principle of the Constitution and the presentment clause. The House had sought to circumvent the presidential veto power expressly made in the Constitution, which the founding framers awarded to the President to guard against unwise legislation and encroachments on executive power. In short, a law must pass both houses, and the President must be afforded the opportunity to sign, ignore, or veto. Furthermore, sometimes the fact that Americans have two democratically elected legislatures, House and Senate, means that they are an intended check and balance on each other. The Chapter case was clearly an attempt by the legislature to observe the constitutional role of the President. Okay, finally then, we can look at independent executive agencies. As government has grown, so has its role via independent agencies. But what is of interest to the student of American politics is that they often appear to break the separation of powers doctrine of the Constitution. For example, the Federal Trade Commission was established by Congress in 1914, and this regulated trade practices. Yet the Commission issues rules on forbidden practices, it issues complaints against offenders, and determines after a hearing whether a case has been proven. Therefore, it appears to exercise legislative, executive, and judicial powers. However, although the Supreme Court has struck down two statutory provisions as giving the President unrestrained policy-making power, the Court has accepted the practice where agencies interpret and define the terms of the laws they enforce. One might argue that although these agencies appear to be exercising all three powers, they can be seen to be giving force to the will of Congress, who set the primary standard, or intelligible principle. And the agencies then interpret that and deal with the day-to-day reality of the law. Having said that, from my own experience studying the US Federal Election Commission, I found that when individuals or groups disagreed with the actions or determinations of an executive agency, they often sought to bring the matter for testing or review before the courts. To confuse matters, although the agency is seeking to interpret and apply the law passed by Congress, the courts have often been minded to rule against the executive agency, especially in the case of the Federal Election Commission, because they are seen as encroaching on First Amendment rights to free speech. We hope you found this podcast useful, and for online tuition and more podcasts, visit us at www.marburyeducation.co.uk. Thanks for listening.